Hello, my name is Alex King, and this presentation is over the pros and cons of nuclear power. Mankind's first successful attempt to harness nuclear power occurred during the Manhattan Project during the 1940s. This was used to develop the atomic bombs that were used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, which ultimately ended World War II. This entered the world into what's known as the Atomic Age, and soon began the arms race in the Cold War. Until later in that time period, nuclear power was mainly used for weapons manufacturing, but it was discovered that nuclear power could be used to generate electricity in the same way that fossil fuels could. This has led to nuclear reactors and power plants across the country. And many debate whether it is still safe to have these nuclear power plants because of incidences such as Chernobyl. And more recently, first, we're going to talk about the pros of using nuclear energy, such as its characteristic of being a green energy and its sustainability in some aspects. Also, its availability and the amount of electricity that it can produce. First, we're going to talk about the cost of using nuclear energy. Uranium-235 is the main source of fuel for nuclear reactors, and to mine, process, and use uranium is actually much cheaper than fossil fuels. All in all, the main expense comes in the construction of the building because the buildings themselves require advanced shielding to protect workers from the lethal doses of radiation that are emitted by the control rods, and also the advanced cooling systems needed to prevent a meltdown, as seen in places like Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and Fukushima. Next, we're going to talk about power production. Nuclear plants are very efficient at producing power, which in turn results in a large base load of electricity that they're able to put out. This is the constant rate that they're able to produce for areas such as cities, urban areas, but also residential neighborhoods, as that power can be spread out due to its large capacity. It can meet high needs and operate industrial areas, which is something that green energies like wind and solar fail to do. They fail to meet that high demand. And it produces a constant rate of electricity. There's no off period, except for in cases of emergency. So unlike a dam, which has periods of on and off, as a constant on for a dam would cause the region below to flood, a nuclear power plant can be run indefinitely as long as the cooling system is able to operate efficiently. One thing about nuclear power is that it isn't a renewable resource, even though people categorize it as a green energy because it doesn't produce any carbon dioxide emissions. There is a finite amount of uranium on the Earth, and once that uranium runs out, we can't really use traditional fission nuclear reactions in order to power reactors. However, several countries are modifying and experimenting with thorium as an alternative to uranium, and many countries such as China are having high amounts of success with that, and they're moving forward and converting their existing nuclear reactors to be able to work with thorium more efficiently. Another use of nuclear energy is something called fission, which is the combining of hydrogen atoms in order to form more dense helium atoms. This occurs naturally in stars. So what you would literally be doing is creating a star on the Earth, creating a plasma stream in a magnetic containment field, which would literally provide you with limitless power. All you would have to do is keep feeding it hydrogen and lithium. And this would literally solve every single energy crisis that the world faces today. It would be a miracle of scientific research and development, but right now it is a real engineering and challenge for scientists to get it just right. So it's still developing, but it's on the way, and it could totally change the game in the industry, in the energy industry. Now we're going to start talking about the cons, the bad things associated with nuclear power. This includes things like radioactive waste and meltdowns. One of the unfortunate consequences of using nuclear energy is all the radioactive waste that's produced. The uranium-235 that's used in the control rods will eventually go bad to where it's decayed to the point where it can no longer be used to produce power efficiently, but there's really nowhere to put it. It's a hazardous waste material, but it takes over 100 million years for it to fully decay because of its outstanding half-life. It becomes a problem when you have hundreds of thousands of tons of this that you have to store. And effects from exposure can lead to cancer, birth defects, miscarriages, a plethora of illnesses. In the 1970s, there was a case in Niagara Falls, New York, called Love Canal, where a chemical company had buried thousands of tons of nuclear waste under this town and sealed it with a clay cap, and they built a school over it. Well, the clay cap cracked, and it started to leak radioactive waste into the surrounding area, which in turn caused kids to develop autism, epilepsy. They saw a very high rate of miscarriages and birth defects. And at that point, there was really no legal recourse for what that company had done, and that caused a large environmental movement to regulate nuclear waste. But it's still very much a problem today, especially in developing countries who have access to nuclear energy, and even countries like China that don't have really any regulation at all about how that waste is spent. It's dumped straight into rivers, and it becomes a serious environmental problem. Meltdowns are arguably the worst thing that can happen with a nuclear power plant. It was seen in Chernobyl during the Cold War that the Soviet Union had a nuclear power plant have a catastrophic meltdown, and it literally exploded. And this produced a fallout that traveled from Chernobyl all the way to England because of the wind. And all along its path, especially in the immediate area, there were birth defects. There was radioactive contamination in livestock feed. The effects of it are still felt today, and that area, Chernobyl, is still quarantined off by the Western European nations and Russia as a no-go zone because it's still highly radioactive. 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania was almost the U.S.'s Chernobyl. Luckily, there was no catastrophic meltdown at 3 Mile Island, but some radioactive material was released into the atmosphere and into the water near that facility. And it really made the U.S. stop and wonder, is nuclear power worth it? At Fukushima, more recently, the Fukushima power plant went to an almost catastrophic meltdown where it caught fire after a tsunami hit Japan. This is still an ongoing event, but there are reports of higher rates of miscarriage, birth defects, and we still do not know the extent of the damage of this travesty. And so it's another reminder of the large amounts of danger that come with using nuclear energy. Most research into atomic energy was not for the production of power or the betterment of mankind. It has been primarily focused on building weapons. Most of the uranium that has been enriched by nuclear powers has gone to nuclear warfare instead of power production. It was used to end World War II against the Japanese. 2 bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the effects were devastating. People near the blast sites were literally incinerated, and the only thing left behind is their shadows, as depicted in the picture provided. The fallout from that event went on to decimate the landscape because it wasn't a nuclear reactor with uranium-235. It was uranium-238, which is the weaponized version, which it devastates people. And it comes to a point where we really must ask, is nuclear power worth it? Will we misuse it? And is an atomic war possible? In the Cold War, fallout shelters and public training in schools was provided in case of an atomic war. But would we really survive it? Is this the thing that humanity would use to destroy itself? That's the type of question that we need to consider as a nation when looking at using nuclear energy. In conclusion, nuclear energy is currently a viable option for producing power for the US and the world, and with advancements in fusion technology, we can only hope to better our use of atomic power with literally wielding the power of the sun to produce electricity. Now, that may be far off, it may be very, very close to becoming a reality, but we still must be mindful of the current situation involving nuclear power plants that melt down, the proper disposal of radioactive waste. These are things that not only affect us in the short term, like a nuclear meltdown, but will affect generations. Like in Chernobyl, there are still people feeling the after effects of that tragic incident. We can only hope that with time and wisdom, we can use this power of the atom wisely, not only to produce power for ourselves,